It's the new year. Take action for the animals, but how? Here are 5 easy ways to help get animals out of laboratories, and much of it fueled PETA's list of top 5 victories. Get animals out of labs now. Next on the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On this episode, is this the day you decide it's time to do something for the animals? It's on your mind, but it's easier than you think. PETA's Senior VP Kathy Guillermo, head of laboratory investigations at PETA, gives us 5 ways you can make a difference for the animals. And we know they're the top 5 ways because they helped fuel PETA's top victories last year. Here's our conversation on the PETA Podcast. Kathy Guillermo, Senior Vice President, PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department. Welcome to the PETA Podcast.
Thank you.
And it's 2026, the start of 2026. And what have you noticed about our listeners or in general PETA supporters? What are they asking? What do they want?
Well, we know that they want animal rights in general, and specifically they want to stop animal suffering. And I'm here today to say you can be a huge part of our victories, and I'm going to share how you were a huge part of our victories in 2025.
So let's start with, 5 ways to get animals out of laboratories, huh?
You know, so many people, and when I say so many, I mean 85% of the population, according to polls, oppose the use of animals in laboratories for any reason whatsoever. And there's a common misconception that there's not much they can do about it. But I am here to tell you, you can do something. And before I share our victories, I would like to just say briefly that these are 5 things that people can do right now from their own homes, in front of their computers in many cases. The first thing is go to PETA.org and sign up to receive our email alerts, our text messages, our phone calls. This is one of the most effective ways we have to protest and get our message across now. You can take an action with a couple of buttons. You can press keys on the computer and you can send a message to an animal abuser, and those messages have a huge impact. You can receive text messages and reply why, and a message can be sent that way. It's so effective and so easy, and millions of people are doing it now.
A lot of people might think, oh, that's so everyday, it's so trite to send an email or send a text, but it really does have an impact more than people think.
It has an enormous impact because these are universities, they're companies, they're businesses who are exploiting animals, and most of these businesses and government agencies are dependent on public support. And if you're saying to them, I don't support you as long as you harm animals in laboratories, that's a very powerful message. They count them, they worry about them.
Okay, so what's the number 2 thing?
Well, if you're an alumna or an alumnus of a university and that university tests on animals, then you have a voice and you can share that voice. And a simple email message or typewritten letter to your university alumni office saying, I graduated from this university and I will not support you as long as you're testing on animals. Please use research funds for modern animal-free research methods.
And that has an impact?
That does have an impact. And if you belong to an alumni group, you can take this message to your group. We often help people who want to send letters to their alumni groups. They're not really sure about what's happening to animals at laboratories, and we help them with that information.
And it works even if you, like for me, I went to the best heating, ventilation, and air conditioning school in the world. And
well, it may be. Animals are used in all different kinds of ways. So if you're uncertain, you can certainly check with PETA. But I think the top 25 NIH-funded universities are huge users of animals, and that's easily found on a Google list.
And it's like high and low. Like, all right, I kid. I went to an HVAC school, but it was Harvard. But I'm not bragging about that, but it does make a difference, huh?
It does, and we're going to talk about Harvard in a few minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. What's number three?
Well, shop cruelty free. And I think this is one most people are aware of. PETA was the organization that began the first national and then international cruelty free list of cosmetics and household products companies, personal care companies that don't test on animals anywhere in their chain. The companies don't test, they don't commission the tests, and they don't buy from suppliers who test the ingredients they use on animals. We call it PETA's ultimate cruelty free list. And if you go to PETA.org, you can find it. It's searchable, very simple to use. And that also has an important message for companies.
And I remember when there was no list, and I think you helped start it.
Well, there was, when I began at PETA so many decades ago, there was a very brief list of 12 companies. They were all mail order, and those were the only ones that we could be certain were not testing on animals. And they're still favorites on the list today. But now there are more than 5,000 companies that have made that commitment.
Now, it's always complicated to make sure if a company is pure because there's all sorts of questions that go into it. But PETA vets this list and makes sure that these companies are pure and do not test 100%.
To the very best of our ability, we do that. And we require written statements and pledges. We require evidence of the contracts that they have with their suppliers. This should be a campaign that's 100% won. Instead, we're about 95% done with this campaign. There are not any companies that I'm aware of in the world that really want to test their cosmetic ingredients on animals. And nobody tests the finished products on animals unless they're doing it in China for sales there. The complicating factors in this area have been, as I mentioned, China, where animal tests are required for certain ingredients on certain products, and also in legislation in the European Union that because of environmental concerns is requiring tests on animals, even though they aren't predictive of what happens to human beings. We don't have any companies that are saying, I want to test on animals. Sometimes they're being forced to, but it's still very important for consumers not to support those companies. They can always choose not to use ingredients that are required to be tested on animals under regulatory authority.
So, once again, if people do a simple thing like only buy products that are on this list that are cruelty free, that really makes a difference. I mean, it seems such an easy thing. Does it really make that kind of difference?
It has changed the world. The reason there are 5,000 companies on the list is consumer demand. It's that simple. We went undercover inside a cosmetics testing laboratory many years ago. We released that video, and that changed the consumer landscape. It is the people who buy these products who are driving the policy.
All right. Number four. What's the number four thing to help people? By the way, people can act to get animals out of laboratories.
Well, if you have kids in school and they are being required to dissect animals, and in many states there are now, well, I shouldn't say many, but in several states there are now options for kids who refuse to do that or don't want to do that. But we have a very positive thing that can be done. We have developed what is called the kind frog, and it is a synthetic frog that looks very much like a real one. It can be cut open, its organs can be removed, but it was never alive. And you can buy one to donate to a school. You can share information with the schools in your district. There is information on the PETA website about this too.
But are you really getting the academic experience, the intellectual, scholarly experience that was the purpose or the driver behind dissection?
The scholarly experience of being complicit in the killing of an animal and the cutting up of his corpse? No, you're not getting that
Mm.
exactly. But there was never much of a purpose to that anyway. We know that dissection on animals is not the gateway to the sciences, but is the gateway to the indoctrination of children to say to them it's okay to treat animals like objects in a laboratory.
Once again, I go back to this test. A simple thing like this, like standing up in your school or your kid is in class and you say, I want to write a note to the teacher, the biology head, or the principal, that makes a difference?
It makes a huge difference. And knowing that these people who object are supporters of PETA also makes a difference. When my kids were in high school and they were in an international baccalaureate program, and when they got to the biology classes, they asked their instructors if animals would be dissected, and their teachers responded without hesitation, "We would be in trouble with PETA."
All right, what's the fifth?
The fifth one is to be in touch with your members of Congress, and that is to ask them to pass what is called the Cargo Act. It stands for Cease Animal Research Grants Overseas. It's a bipartisan bill in the House and in the Senate, and it was introduced after PETA revealed a laboratory in Colombia, South America, funded by NIH, in which there were monkeys, but they weren't exactly in a laboratory. There were stacks of cages in a forest, and there was a tarp over those cages, and the monkeys were treated terribly. There was no veterinarian. There was no decent food for them, even. We ended up closing that facility down and getting all the monkeys and the mice into sanctuaries. But what we found as a result of that is that there really is no oversight of laboratories funded by our government when they're outside of the United States. It's a very simple thing. Just cut the funding for animal experiments in laboratories overseas.
Well, that's the key word. It's overseas. Does it really matter? Because a lot of people might hear that and say, well, the overseas lab, don't you really want to get the labs right here?
We want to get them all. We want to shut down every laboratory run by every government agency, every company, every university, every school in the world. There's no question about that. But this is an easy place to begin and end a whole lot of cruelty and much suffering, and frankly, waste of funds that are going to experiments that in many cases are cruel. Well, in all cases are cruel, and in many cases pointless. And if you go to the PETA website or simply Google Cargo Act and PETA, there's a whole list of what's being funded overseas right now that I don't think people are going to like very much.
All right. So those are the 5 ways to help get animals out of laboratories. Our second group is PETA's top 5 victories for animals in laboratories. So we had the action. What are the results?
Well, it was tough for me to choose because I want to be very clear there were many victories for animals in laboratories this year. But I've selected the ones that were, in some cases, some of the more difficult fights that we had for animals. And I think what's important about each of these individual victories is that they represent something that's much bigger. When you shut down a single laboratory, the message is sent to other laboratories throughout this country that this kind of abuse won't be tolerated. And on top of that, at the end of this wonderful list I have, I'd like also to mention that the government is stepping up in broader ways to help on this issue too. But number one, we
Mhm.
shut down the marmoset killing laboratory at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I think most PETA supporters will know, and those who are not familiar with our work should understand that this was a laboratory that used tiny marmoset monkeys to study menopause, even though these monkeys don't actually experience menopause. And there were some pretty terrible things done to these animals. We waged a 4-year campaign against this laboratory. 160,000 advocates joined us in this. There were 1.4 million messages sent by PETA supporters. We had protests, we had ads, we disrupted their speakers, we had celebrities appeal. We gathered massive support and we filed a lawsuit. And finally, University of Massachusetts announced that it was shutting down.
Now, how much was wasted in terms of taxpayer monies?
Well, in this case, several $1 million. And I think it's important to know that experimenters will embark on a career studying one or two things, and then they'll spend the next 30 years doing that, even if they don't get anything out of it. And not much came out of these experiments.
So this was, I mean, it sounds like if, regardless of how you feel about the animals, It was a boondoggle. It was a waste. It shouldn't have It shouldn't have been sustained throughout the. Well, PETA's protest was 4 years, but I assume this had gone on well beyond 4 years.
It certainly had, and when uh, um, it was the kind of campaign that when you explain to people what it is you're trying to stop, people can't believe that taxpayer money goes to support that. I
Mm.
mean, it really is quite stunning that these little tiny animals who are like us in some ways, they experience pain and joy, they have families, they have communities, but they don't undergo menopause. And the trying to mimic menopause in them through drugs and, believe it or not, hand warmers to mimic hot flashes obviously would never and did never lead to anything useful.
All right, so that was one. What's number two?
Well, number two is that we got the funding cut for Harvard's baby monkey torture test.
Hmm.
And this was a 2.5 year long campaign. We used ads, we had federal complaints, we gathered support from 300 scientists from around the world, including Dr. Jane Goodall. There were 700,000 emails from supporters that went to Harvard and went to NIH calling for the funding to be cut. And this is an experimenter, Margaret Livingston, who takes infant or took infant monkeys from their mothers and does various horrible things to them. She has sewn shut their eyelids. She's forced some to wear strobe light goggles. She actually had monkeys raised in isolation and deprived them of ever seeing another face. Now they were removed from other monkeys, so they obviously didn't see their mothers' faces. But the humans who took care of them, and I use the word care cautiously, wore welding masks. And this was another one that used millions of taxpayer dollars, really led to nothing useful, and the funding was cut in 2025.
And yet Harvard defended it for a while, didn't it?
Well, Harvard defends a lot of really awful things, apparently. But yes, it certainly did. And I think the fear of universities, and it's important to understand this, the fear of universities is that if they, quote, give in once, they may have to do it again. And they worry about the message that sends to scientists that they want to bring to work at the university if the university won't stand by the scientists. Now, you notice what's missing from that is the actual science. Nobody seemed to care whether or not there was anything useful at all about what Margaret Livingston was doing to these monkeys. And that was what the 300 scientists we worked with, that was the message that they brought.
All right. When something like this happens to Harvard, does it have impact on other universities where they say, oh, well, we got to follow Harvard? Or do people sort of dig in?
No, without question, it has an effect. And it has an effect on young scientists as well. When they see that if they do certain things, they are vulnerable to losing their funding, then that worries them. So one of the things that happens at universities is that a professor who does experiments on animals will have graduate students and doctoral students working for them. And they will then indoctrinate these students to continue their work. They have in the American scientific community family trees of monkey experimenters, for example, and they've all learned from their so-called parents and grandparents how it is that they can torment animals and get papers published.
What's number three?
Well, number three was very important. We were able to ensure that a disgraced former primate center head was forbidden to experiment on animals for at least a year. And this is important because it's unprecedented. This is the University of Washington. They have what's called the Washington National Primate Research Centers, and PETA is working diligently to close down all 7 of these federally funded primate centers. And the experimenters is a woman named Michelle Basso. She was the director of the primate center. That was problematic. And after we produced information for the Board of Regents at the university, they removed her as director of the primate center. And in 2025, the oversight committee at the university cited her repeated rule breaking and the loss of trust in her. And they echoed our calls for accountability, and they cut off her access to animals for at least a year.
So the significance here in terms of how it ripples throughout the research community, does it have an impact?
It has a huge impact. First of all, it has an impact on those monkeys she was tormenting in her experiments. But the second aspect of this is that it's very unusual for an oversight committee to take away the animal access privileges of an experimenter. These committees are largely rubber stamp committees, and they approve what's put in front of them in many cases. And this was a departure from that.
So that must indicate that this was a woman who did some very egregious things.
That's right. That's right. And to lose the trust of your veterinary staff at an experimentation facility, that takes some doing. Basso had been in trouble at University of Wisconsin, where she was before, and her privileges had temporarily been taken away from her there, too. So it's very unusual, and she's a repeat offender.
All right. Number 4 in the list of the top 5 victories for animals in laboratories.
Well, on the topic of the National Primate Research Centers, we have been working very hard over the last year to shut down the Oregon National Primate Research Center. And we have been joined by the majority of Oregonians who have called for the closure, by the governor of the state who has said it's time for this primate center to close, and by members of the legislature. And lawmakers this year passed a budget note telling the Oregon National Primate Research Center, which is part of Oregon Health and Science University, that it has to submit a plan to close by 2026 if it uses even 1 penny of state money to run, or if its funding agency, the National Institutes of Health, cuts its funding by 25%. And this is the first time that a primate center's future has been tied to state funding. And this is an indication of how serious lawmakers are in their concern and distaste for this primate center.
So you're working on that coming soon?
Well, we certainly hope so. There's going to be a discussion next week by the university's board of directors on the budget note and on the primate center. And we think that the future lies, of course, in animal-free research, but these 7 national primate research centers have been operating for many, many decades now. For one example, they have been working on trying to develop a vaccine for HIV for 40 years. Every attempt has failed. And I think it's time to say goodbye to these for ethical and for scientific reasons. And this is where I can compliment Harvard, because there used to be 8 primate research centers. And about 10 years ago, Harvard saw the writing on the wall and closed theirs.
All right. So there's 4. What's the 5th? Top 5 victories for animals in laboratories.
Well, I've cheated a little bit here because I put a whole bunch of small individual victories in here. We have, within our laboratory investigations department, we have several divisions. We have about 10 scientists who are working on issues. We have researchers, we have campaigners, and they work on a whole lot of areas where we receive whistleblower calls or where we find out that animals are being used in ways that they don't need to be used because they never need to be used, but in ways that could be easily replaced by non-animal methods. So I threw a whole bunch of things in here. If I could just go down through a couple of them.
Yeah, name them.
All right. Well, we've been working on Taiwan's Food and Drug Administration to eliminate their requirements for tests on animals in order to make health claims about food. And they were allowing gruesome tests in which they removed the ovaries of mice, rats, and hamsters. They fed them calcium-deficient diets to cause osteoporosis, and then they killed them. And they are no longer requiring or allowing that. And that's a shift that follows 28,000 messages from PETA supporters.
Hmm.
And then the second one is that we continue our work on the important effort to stop the forced swim test, in which little animals, hamsters, mice, rats, are dropped into beakers of water. They're forced to swim until eventually they give up in exhaustion. And at this point, we know that this test doesn't tell anything about what's going to happen with depression drugs in humans, which is what it's often used for. We persuaded the top pharma companies to stop using it. And we had another life sciences company ban it this year, as well as some agencies in Australia and other countries stop allowing it and stop requiring it.
Right. The forced swim test, that was a bit, you've been working on that a while, but a little victory on this one.
Well, I think we're doing away with it bit by bit. Once we persuaded the big pharma companies to stop using it and persuaded the FDA to release a statement saying that it's not required for any drugs that they would consider approving, that was a huge breakthrough.
Next.
All right, we got the European Respiratory Society to stop using live animals in medical training courses. They were having trainees practice invasive procedures on piglets, pigs, and sheep, and they were inserting tubes into their airways and cutting into their chests. That's all gone.
And the fifth?
We have the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They have what's called the Food Research Institute there. And they are taking money from many food companies to do experiments on animals. We began talking to all these companies and asked them to restrict their funding to non-animal methods only. So now more than a dozen companies have said, if you want us to support you, you can't use one penny of our money to harm animals. And in response, they launched the Animal Free Research Fund.
Well, and all this is from negotiation, and it's also your scientists backing up the assertions PETA makes, and the university's listening.
That's exactly right. And it's so important. These are, I mean, I call these smaller efforts, but they're very important because they have an influence on a whole industry in many cases, the pharmaceutical industry and the medical training industry. And all of these are things that you don't hear much about, but which are very important.
Those were PETA's top 5 victories for animals in laboratories, and we had 5 ways to help get animals out of laboratories. And tell me about the current administration, because regardless of what happens, overall with the administration, in terms of the animals, what has the administration done? How is it when it comes to animals?
We've seen some real movement here. It's never fast enough for our liking, but animal protection and animal rights has always been a nonpartisan or a bipartisan issue. We have always had support from both sides of the congressional aisle, and very proud of the work that we have done. And this year we began to see the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the FDA. We began to see them act on some of the recommendations that we have been making over the last decade. And I think the first most important thing was that NIH announced that it is going to be prioritizing animal-free research methods rather than what the agency has done for many decades, which is to put most of its money, or at least half of its money, into experiments on animals. So what this has meant, let me just run through a couple of these. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, announced that it's ending its own experiments on monkeys inside its own facilities. This is a huge shift because the CDC was doing quite a number of experiments on monkeys. We have seen a halt in the funding for primate-based vaccine testing. And this came out of, I believe, the COVID vaccine, where they really didn't need to use animals in order to bring this vaccine to market. And so now they're pulling funding away from testing these vaccine on animals. The FDA has asked the pharmaceutical industry to replace the use of primates, dogs, pigs, and other animals in its tests. This is an important directive. We have seen that they are working hard to replace animals for monoclonal antibodies. And I won't dive into the science on that, partly because I'm not a scientist and I would need somebody on my staff to explain it. But monoclonal antibodies are used in virtually every area of animal experimentation. NIH opened an organoid modeling center, and these are human-based in vitro technologies. They're models of organs that don't involve animals, and it's very exciting that they have put $87 million into this endeavor to replace animals. I think the message is clear here that what has happened is that this administration has accepted the idea, which we have not seen previous administrations of either party do, which is that animal experiments are failing to help humans, they're not ethical, and they can be replaced.
For this fine point of animals in labs, the administration is doing pretty well.
So far, so good. I would like to see the National Institutes of Health speed up their cancellation of particularly cruel grants or particularly cruel experiments on animals. I think that needs to happen, and we'll continue to press for that. But they're moving in the right direction. I think people need to get active now. It's easy to do. It makes a huge difference, and we will end animal experimentation.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior VP on laboratory investigations. On the top 5 things you can do to help crack PETA's top 5 victories list for next year. But the ideas are pretty simple, like using cruelty-free cosmetics or sending an email and signing up for an action alert. On PETA.org, those emails do make a difference. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on X or Twitter at Emil Amok. You can see me at AMOK.com or find this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. I like CastBox. They don't, they don't pay for an ad or anything, but I think they list all of them. You go all the way back to number 1 on CastBox. If you wanted to hear every PETA podcast and say, oh, wow, he was using that mixer that day. Yeah. Hey, our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.